Why is everyone so fixated on narcissism? Open any feed, and you're immediately buried under an avalanche of content. Endless checklists for spotting narcissists, survival guides, and elaborate taxonomies of toxic personality types. It's a collective hunger that hasn't let up in years. But underneath all this public appetite for exposing others lies something more than intellectual curiosity. This obsession is always, in some way, directed back at ourselves. Today, we'll be looking at the part of the personality structure that tends to get shoved into the unconscious, the narcissistic shadow. We'll examine why narcissism isn't always pathology, and when it actually serves an adaptive function. Why the neurotic personality type is so perfectly complementary to the narcissistic one, and what makes this symbiosis tick. Why each party essentially cannot function without the other. For our case study, we're returning to The Devil Wears Prada. There's already an analysis of this film on the channel where we looked closely at who the real antagonist of the story actually is. But today, we're shifting the lens entirely. We're less interested in who plays what role, and more interested in the internal dynamics. Should you bring your narcissistic side out into the light, or is it safer to keep it locked in the basement of your unconscious? To understand the dynamics of this story, you have to stop looking at Andy as an innocent victim of circumstance. In terms of personality structure, what we have here is a classic neurotic, someone whose entire functioning is organized around external validation. Andy's core deficit is the absence of any internal permission to simply exist without external confirmation. Her baseline need is unconditional approval, which she pursues at virtually any cost. This turns her into a kind of psychological chameleon. Andy will instantly reshape herself to match whatever her environment demands, changing her values, her style, her whole self, just to get that pat on the head. Being seen as good, as the star student, as the one who did everything right, that's the only reliable fuel she has for her self-worth. This structure inevitably produces a critical erosion of personal boundaries. Andy doesn't just tolerate things she shouldn't, she's been conditioned to. We see this in how she absorbs the snide remarks of her colleagues, and more tellingly, in how she operates in her relationships with friends and her partner. She doesn't push back, she explains herself. She apologizes even when she has nothing to apologize for. Any conflict feels like a threat of disconnection from someone important, which for her means a threat to her own coherence as a person. She doesn't come to Runway for a journalism career. She comes for a stamp of approval on her own exceptionalism. She desperately needs someone larger and more terrifying than herself, a figure of Miranda Priestley's magnitude, whose nod of recognition would legitimize her right to take up space in this world. Her entire arc in the film is an attempt to prove to the system that she deserves to be found worthy. And in the process of chasing that approval, we see just how far a person can drift when their inner self is entirely dependent on the verdict of others. But there's a second, less obvious dimension. Neurotics frequently disguise their own narcissism beneath a veneer of moral or intellectual superiority. Think back to the beginning of the film. Andy makes a point of performing her contempt for the fashion world. She is convinced she's above all this, smarter, more serious, more substantive than everyone around her. This is a textbook covert, narcissistic stance. I'm better than you because I'm not as shallow as you. She also carries a sharp, if not always conscious, envy toward those who have already made it to the top. Looking at successful colleagues, Andy soothes herself with the idea of her own specialness. The world just hasn't recognized the full scope of her talent yet. Hasn't acknowledged what makes her unique. But unlike an overt narcissist, the neurotic cannot come right out and claim their right to greatness. They cloak their ambition in a noble cause, in Andy's case, journalism. This is a specific mechanism. Neurotics suppress their inner narcissist, redirecting achievement energy into the realm of fantasy. They can spend years lovingly tending to a mental image of their own eventual triumph, while never actually moving toward it. to bring their narcissism out of the shadows and say aloud, "I deserve more," they first need to meet a series of stringent internal requirements. They need an authority figure's blessing, a byline in a prestigious publication, some external proof that legitimizes their right to superiority. The neurotic doesn't envy the narcissist for their material success. What draws them is what the narcissist possesses as a given, an unshakable certainty about their right to occupy space in this world. The moment Andy's intellectual exceptionalism collides with the real, crushing force of Miranda, her psychological defenses collapse, and we see what Andy actually wants: access to greatness. She no longer wants to be the smart girl standing in the wings. She starts fighting for her place in the hierarchy, using the very tools she once claimed to despise. If Andy lives in a constant state of self-compression, trying to take up as little room as possible and dodge any criticism, her boss, Miranda Priestley, runs the diametrically opposite play. Miranda is the embodiment of grandiose narcissism, and it's apparent within seconds of her first appearance. She doesn't just occupy space, she expands her personality until those around her are quite literally crowded out. Her categorical nature and relentless demands aren't just personality quirks. They're the mechanisms by which she maintains an inner structure that has no tolerance for weakness. Empathy or compassion, in any conventional sense, isn't part of Miranda's toolkit. People are either instruments toward her ends or mirrors, obligated to reflect her magnificence back to her. The famous rule forbidding employees from sharing an elevator with her is a perfect metaphor for the kind of grandiosity that requires every available cubic foot of space to itself. But beneath that armor lies a different kind of need. Miranda only appears self-sufficient. In reality, she is critically dependent on the quality of her reflection. She surrounds herself with perfectionists and workaholics precisely because their neurotic striving makes her own goddess status shine brighter by contrast. She commands enormous social capital and is capable of showing almost preternatural attentiveness to the people who matter to her. But it's essential to understand that attentiveness is always functional. Miranda is tuned in to the needs of others exactly as long as those people remain useful to her goals, or are actively confirming her status by serving as her mirror. Unlike Andy, Miranda doesn't ruminate, doesn't agonize, doesn't second-guess herself. She is always right and always indispensable. If you asked her why she's certain she'll become a legend, she wouldn't justify herself or appeal to external authorities the way Andy would. She would simply look at you in a way that makes you question your own grasp on reality. This absolute, unearned audacity, the bedrock certainty that she deserves only the best, at all times, is precisely what simultaneously triggers and magnetically attracts neurotics who have spent their entire lives trying to earn the right to exist. The psychological chemistry between Andy and Miranda is not a random collision of two incompatible personalities. It's a perfectly interlocking mechanism. In psychology, this is often called a complementary pairing, a relationship where one person's deficit is covered by the other's excess. They're a match made in dysfunction, condemned to codependency because they function as two halves of a single whole. Miranda, as a grandiose narcissist, cannot do without mirrors. She doesn't merely need people to execute tasks. She needs them to reflect her greatness through their diligence, their fear, and their awe. The neurotic is the ideal candidate for this role. Andy, with her baseline insecurity and desperate need for approval, is willing to bend and reshape her boundaries to whatever degree necessary, just to feel needed. She becomes the perfect mirror, one that, over time, reflects Miranda's image with ever-increasing clarity. The neurotic, in turn, is drawn to the narcissist precisely because of an acute lack of internal grounding. Miranda radiates everything Andy doesn't have: total ownership of her own subjectivity, the complete absence of self-doubt, and the ability to dictate her own terms to the world. For Andy, proximity to such a sun, is a way of warming herself in the glow of someone else's certainty. She essentially outsources to Miranda the right to be powerful, and in exchange receives a sense of belonging to something grand. But this symbiosis is always built on exploitation. The narcissist uses the neurotic as a tool, while the neurotic uses the narcissist as an external conscience and a source of permission. The problem is that this dynamic leaves no room for genuine connection. There's only functional exchange. Andy begins to believe that her worth grows in direct proportion to how precisely she anticipates Miranda's desires. And Miranda becomes ever more convinced that the world revolves around her, so long as there's someone willing to stop the earth from spinning to retrieve her coffee. It's a closed loop in which one person can only grow by psychologically depleting the other. Now we arrive at the crux of it, the moment the good girl mask starts to crack. Andy's transformation in Paris is often read as a fall from grace, a corruption of her character under the influence of the villainous Miranda. But from the perspective of depth psychology, this isn't a corruption of character at all. It's the legalization of her own narcissistic shadow. Think about how Andy carries herself at the start. She's armored by her intellectual snobbery. But this isn't the absence of narcissism, it's its covert, passive form. She considers herself better than others on the basis of her principles and her degrees. This is an inherently fragile construction, though, because it isn't backed by any real power. When Miranda starts giving Andy actual authority, genuinely difficult challenges, and, crucially, access to rooms that were previously closed to her, Andy discovers something. Being special through real influence feels considerably better than being special through imagined superiority. Paris is the point of no return. The moment Andy takes Emily's place is an act of pure narcissistic triumph. She is no longer apologizing. She is no longer just enduring. She makes the choice that puts her effectiveness and her position first. The narcissistic part she spent years bricking up in the basement of her psyche finally walks out into the light and finds that it very much likes it here. For the neurotic, this emergence of the shadow feels like an extraordinary release. Narcissistic traits aren't only about self-centeredness. They also include psychological resilience, the capacity to claim ownership of your own achievements, and the ability to choose yourself without constantly scanning the room to make sure no one is made uncomfortable. During this period, Andy stops being a chameleon adapting to whatever her environment demands and begins setting the terms herself. She learns to let her inner narcissist off the leash, using that energy to pursue goals that once seemed entirely out of reach. The complication is that shadow integration is a painful process. The people around her, accustomed to the convenient, predictable good girl version of Andy, experience her growth as a betrayal. But what's really happening is simpler and more uncomfortable. They're not prepared for the fact that Andy no longer needs their approval as badly as she needs her own permission to be formidable. The psychological showdown reaches its climax in the car when Miranda delivers her most telling line, "You remind me of myself. I see myself in you." At this point, the masks are fully off. Miranda recognizes in Andy not merely a talented assistant, but a player capable of cold calculation and hard choices in the name of ambition. For Miranda, this is the highest possible compliment. For Andy, it lands like a death sentence. This scene lays bare the vast and defining difference between the grandiose narcissist and the narcissistic neurotic. On the surface, they can look nearly identical, both ambitious, both effective, both willing to make sacrifices. But the underlying machinery of their psyches operates on fundamentally different principles. Neurotics, unlike narcissists, possess a far more developed capacity for self-reflection and a much more active internal critic. For Miranda, outmaneuvering a rival or burning a colleague is simply part of doing business. It produces no inner turbulence whatsoever. For Andy, Each such move lands as a direct blow to the core of who she is. She has come to understand that staying in Miranda's orbit won't merely require hard work. It will require the systematic betrayal of her foundational values. For the narcissist, betraying your principles is not really possible, because their primary principle is their own greatness and success. For the neurotic, this kind of self-abandonment leads to the disintegration of the self. Andy realizes that the price of success under Miranda's patronage is a permanent severing of contact with herself, and an unrelenting guilt that the neurotic simply cannot switch off at will. Narcissism in itself is neither categorically destructive nor unambiguously good. It's a personality structure whose functionality depends entirely on degree. What our analysis reveals is that the collective obsession with this topic is driven less by a genuine desire to expose toxic people, and more by the neurotic's covert need to understand and legitimize their own suppressed ambitions. The neurotic tends to camouflage their hunger for greatness behind a mask of moral superiority or intellectual snobbery, genuinely believing they are better than others by virtue of their depth and complexity. And yet, a healthy narcissistic component is absolutely critical to functional living. It's the source of psychological resilience, personal charisma, and the ability to claim your own achievements without waiting for an outside authority to sign off on them first. Bringing your shadow qualities into the light is a painful process, and it only becomes possible in an environment where ambition isn't smothered by shame, but is allowed to become fuel for real growth. The crucial distinction between the grandiose narcissist and the neurotic, which we see so precisely in the contrast between Miranda and Andy, lies in the preservation of reflective capacity and conscience. The neurotic type can successfully incorporate narcissistic tools in the pursuit of their goals, but they cannot fully disengage their internal critic without destroying the very foundation of who they are. Ultimately, The Devil Wears Prada teaches us that genuine self-awareness doesn't begin with the ability to see through other people. It begins with the willingness to acknowledge your own blind spots, and to find the balance between reaching for greatness and holding on to your humanity. The narcissistic part of you doesn't need to be sealed away in the basement of your unconscious. It needs to be made visible, so it works for you rather than running your life from the shadows. And if your inner critic is quietly telling you that this analysis touched on something in your own blind spots, don't suppress that honest impulse. Like and subscribe so you don't miss the next psychological deep dive, and drop a comment letting me know. Have you found a way to work with your own narcissistic shadow, or is it still very much in the basement?